like, hey, this is being recorded kind of thing? Are we expecting that?
I think once my note taker's in there, yeah, we're recording now. So note
Awesome.
taker's in there. Let's go.
All right. Well, this is our first sync after Iceberg Summit, and I think that went incredibly well. So I want to say a huge thank you to all of our speakers. I know like probably half the people here were speakers at Iceberg Summit. It was really amazing to see the community come together. We had twice as many talks as we initially planned because we were running on single track for 2 days, and we did double track for 2 days. The talks were excellent. And so very big thank you to everyone who submitted and gave talks. Especially to JB, who helped organize everything, and all of you who also helped us make the sponsorships happen. We got more sponsors than we actually needed for promotion, and I believe that we're going to just take the remainder of that money and donate it to the Apache Software Foundation. So really good things all around, and we're really excited to see this and make a yearly thing. The videos will be up on YouTube. It says later today. I'm hoping that it actually means later today. I have not been involved in this, but we'll let everyone know on the mailing list and the announce channel when that goes out. Yeah, huge success and pretty amazing to see us get to a spot where we have, such a big conference that's very well attended. I think we were nearly 60% attendance rate of the almost 3,000 signups. So really, really cool. All right. With that, I'm going to shut up about Iceberg Summit, and I will hand things over to Dan to go through the Java highlights because he did them this week.
Okay, I'll go ahead and take them. Let's see, just 1 second here. Okay, so there's a few things on the Java side that I wanted to highlight. Of course, as always, like this isn't everything that went in, so feel free to go take a look at the commit log. There are other things you may be interested in. First one, thanks to JB, fixing some of the Rev API issues that we were having, and that's moved outside of Gradle. JB, do you have just 1 moment to comment on, like, is there any change for anybody at this point to how Rev API works? Do they need to do anything extra, or is it just going to catch them in the CI build process if they break Rev API?
So yeah, the 2 options will be possible. First option will be to run the Rev API script manually, and I will add a workflow item to execute the Rev API check on each PR. So the only challenge that we are facing now is the Gradle plugin uses a Rev API YAML for accepting breaks, which is specific to the Gradle plugin. So the Rev API standalone distribution use a different format. So I added an example what would be the new format. So I chatted in with Foucault and Edouard to see if we keep the old format and I have to transform, or if we add the new format. So just some touches like that, but yeah, both options will be possible. So
okay.
Working on that because it's a blocker to update Gradle, basically.
Okay, and then like the main other thing is like the CI still does the actual Rev API check, so we won't get unintentional changes in. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next one is Amog. Thanks, Amog, for adding some retries in the JDBC catalog. I know that there are a number of problems with the connection retries and issues that people have been having out there, so thank you very much. Thanks to, I'm going to mess up the name, so I'm not going to say it. Ryan, do you know how to pronounce? Is it
Huashin?
Huashin Gao? So thank you very much for adding the bloom filter. So this is extra configuration to kind of adjust the sensitivity on the bloom filters. The next one, thanks Edward. This has been a long-standing issue, partitioning by UUID. I think generally that's not a great practice, but I do think that there are some use cases out there where if they are not truly unique IDs in your records, then partitioning may be still a reasonable thing. But generally, if they truly are unique, don't partition by them. That will result in bad layouts, one file per record, which is generally not a good thing. And then the last one here is some coercing of underlying Parquet types, so shorts and bytes in the Parquet writer. And thanks to Tradul for that. And with that, I will hand it over to Faco, and he can go through the Python ones. Is Faco here?
Yeah, I am.
Okay.
Thanks, Devin.
Yeah.
Yeah, Python with like a couple of new updates here. Thanks, thank you, Lee, for working on the retile logic. That's always high for locking is always a big issue. So thanks for fixing that. We have a register table using Glue. Thanks, Mehul, again for working on that. We have an initial implementation of the manifest table. So yeah, we now almost have like all the metadata tables complete, which is great, including the manifest one. We have hierarchical namespaces for SQL catalog. I actually didn't know that this was possible, but it was in the Java, so now it's also possible on the Python side. And we have support for arrow categorical types. So yeah, an arrow can encode as a categorical, and we can also support this in Iceberg. Want me to go over the Rust ones as well?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so Rust, a lot of progress being made there, especially on the query planning side, which is very exciting. So we have the inclusive metrics evaluator there right now. We're now wiring everything together just to get, I think we're quite close actually to evaluating the partitions, but also the file statistics. So that's really exciting. Thanks, Scott, for doing a lot of work on there. A couple of more folks who put in a lot of work in there, so thank you for that. And push down of the predicates into the Parquet reader. This is actually taking an Iceberg Rust predicate and converting it into an arrow predicate. So we can actually push it down into the arrow Parquet reader, which is, of course, always great. On the Go side, we also see progress on the literals have been added, and today also the first PR and the follow-up PR expression has been added there. So that's also exciting to see. Bits?
So one I just wanted to add in there, and we can even add this on the list for later, but Amog did finally land the Trino view support in Iceberg. So congrats, Amog, and for finally getting that in. And I know that a lot of people here have been waiting for that. So
Thanks, Bits. That's a really big one. Thanks for adding that. Back to you, Ryan.
All right. I'll get the last one for Go, which is we're still building out the expression support, and literals were recently added. So really great to see the Go stuff still progressing. Also, just to come back to the inclusive metrics evaluator in Rust, like inclusive metrics evaluator is probably the one of the most important things. So really neat to have that in there. That's a big step forward towards being able to plan scans. So awesome. Thank you, everyone. Really great to see all the progress. All right. And now let's talk releases. Sounds like there is a Jackson problem that might warrant a 1.5.3 release. Do we know when this was introduced?
It's always been present in Jackson.
Okay, we just now have a fix for it?
There's a fix that was prominently highlighted by warnings from Jackson. We couldn't prevent these warnings, so it just said, okay, use that class instead of that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is this something that does warrant a patch release? Because I'm wondering, like, if we've always had this problem and no one ever sees it or hits it, you know, do we want to do a patch release, or do we want to just roll this into the 1.6?
It's something that you can hit, so the probability is low, but if you hit it, you have no real, without a heap dump and probably, yeah, so analyzation, you don't even know what's happened. So if you run into it, you don't notice it. You just notice that the process doesn't make any more progress. It's a class loader deadlock.
Okay. I don't know who was first, Dan or JB.
JB, you can go.
No, I just wondering if probably we will need to upgrade also Parquet, because Parquet is also using Jackson. So don't know if it's related or not, but I know Foco is working on the Parquet update that include a new version of Jackson. So not sure if it's related or not, but probably. My point is, does it make sense to do a release now? I think we can wait 1.6 probably. I'm not sure it makes sense to rush. Don't know. But
Yeah.
probably we need other updates, just not just Jackson. That's my point.
Dan?
Yeah, I would agree with JB. I think in practice we haven't seen it, and while it's theoretically possible, I don't think we have any instances of anybody reporting anything like this. So I think, you know, it seems reasonable just to bundle into whatever the next release is. If we do a dot release, we can include it for other reasons, but I don't think it's necessarily a driver for a dot release.
Yeah, I agree with that. Robert?
Yeah, generally speaking about patch releases, would it make sense to mark all issues that should be candidates for backports or patch releases separately instead of marking them like mentally?
I think we should probably like port them to the release branch when we commit them.
What we typically do is we have a milestone for whatever the next release is, and we would just pack it under that milestone. So if we want to create a milestone for 1.6, and I believe we already have one, we can just associate this with that milestone. Then the question is, like, do we feel strongly that if we did do a 1.5.4, that we would actually go and pull that from the 1.6 release and you know, put it on that branch?
I think we would probably put it in the branch, but I don't know that we would necessarily make a 1.5.3 release just to get this out. Paco?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Like I checked in Parquet and it's not being used, the property over there. So yeah, it's a very small probability. I do think it would be nice to make more use of the milestones, because it gives like I exclusively mostly use them for like making sure that when I see like an issue, like a bug, that we make sure that it's being included and I mark it as a milestone. But I think also like for also people show up looking at the progress of certain versions, I think it would also be nice just to get up more in the process in general.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of overlap with like how we do branching, because like the 1.6 release will be off of main, and so that includes everything. So then the question is like, well, is it worth putting certain PRs against the 1.6 milestone when in reality everything is against the 1.6 milestone? So I think there's just kind of a question of like, you know, why would we pick certain ones and not everything? Does it make sense to do that?
So I think what we have done in the past is once we start getting close to the release and we need to start communicating things like this is or is not targeting the release, even if that's like softly targeting. I know we change that list at will. Then we use the milestones there. And I think that works pretty well. I think that we've also been fairly good about tagging bugs with the release milestone for patch releases. So I wouldn't necessarily change what we've been doing, but certainly like if you see a bug that should go in a patch release, like definitely flag it and let's get the milestone on there.
So we currently don't have a milestone for like a 1.5.4 release. So we can create that and tag this against it and then continue to accumulate everything. But it's also not clear that we're actually going to do a 1.5.4 release. So
yeah, well, I think 1.5.3 because we're at 1.5.2.
Oh, right? Is it 1.5? Oh, okay.
Yeah. So let's move on to the 1.6 release. When did we do the 1.5 release? I think we were in that period of like, hey, we just did a release, and now, you know, if we're going to do quarterly releases, we need to get back on the train. So let's start targeting 1.6 for anyone know?
March
July?
2024.
March.
It will be June.
Oh wow, okay. So it is time. All right. Would anyone like to volunteer to be release manager? Oh, don't everyone jump at once. JB? All right. Thank you, JB.
Yeah, I can do it. No worries.
All right. Well, yeah, let's start thinking about things that need to go into the 1.6 release, and also start planning on, like, you know, thinking about things carefully before we add them if they have dependencies on other PRs. Because I know that a few times in the past we've gotten into situations where we merge something thinking that this other thing that it requires is going to be there very shortly, and then we end up you know, needing to delay a release because of that. So just be careful when you're merging PRs, I would say, and let's all work towards that release. Thank you, JB, for volunteering for being release manager. Should be great. All right, let's get to discussions, because we have a lot of discussion topics, particularly in the REST catalog area, although I am very interested in discussing variant data types if possible. Hopefully we get down to it. So Jan, do you want to talk about where we're at with materialized views and what we need to do to move forward?
Sure. Well, first, I think it would be really important to kind of figure out how the workflow is supposed to look like. But I think this would also be interesting in general for the proposals, kind of what should be the steps. Because in the materialized views, we have a little bit a confusing situation, because we were always discussing on a Google Doc, but then we agreed upon that we put the Google Doc aside to decide on the storage model, whether we should use a separate view and table or how to do it. Then we had a voting process to decide which storage model to use. But we still had this Google Doc, which was kind of having also discussions of about more detailed things, which kind of is now a little bit on the side, and it's not clear like what's the process now. I'm not sure. I think this is partly because the proposals were just introduced, and maybe the GitHub issue wasn't like really clear, because we suddenly got like a pull request which was kind of different from what has been discussed before on the Google Doc. So I don't know if the whole community should have like one procedure on how these proposals should be handled, or if this should be handled on a case-by-case basis.
So I'll respond to that just because I've been kind of involved with it along with Walla, and I don't think Walla is here, but obviously, like we have kind of introduced a proposal process, which is, you know, creating an issue template, linking off to a Google Doc, and I think we largely followed it. This was a little complicated of a scenario because there were kind of competing ideas and opinions, and we went round and round on that. So I wouldn't like take, you know, this instance and go overboard with heavy process or something like that for other proposals. Where we stand right now, I think we've largely rallied around an approach for how do we represent the storage, and there's still some open questions there. So I think the best thing to do is to take that Google Doc and clean it up, remove any sort of like discussion about options and things like that. The last time I looked at it, there was still like, you know, some content around, hey, there's like 6 different options here, and like discussion around why we would choose one option versus the other, and kind of reformat just to be, hey, what is the direction that we're going forward as an actual proposal, as opposed to a bunch of discussion of different options. And I think we're getting really close to some consensus about what it'll actually look like. So there's still some discussion to be had, but I think the big questions are largely behind us. Does that make sense, Jan?
Yes, well, but I think currently there's still like 2 issues which are still kind of floating around, also in the discussion thread in the mailing list. And what I kind of liked about the options is that if you're coming in, you can kind of see what's out there, and you don't have to go through all the threads on the sides, because the option, of course, the goal would be to, if we decide for an option, to update the document, and the options should just be maybe in the appendix, but they kind of give the reasoning for the decisions that we made then in the document.
It's definitely a good thing to have like discarded alternatives or something like that in the doc. But yeah, I'd say like just move them down to an appendix.
Yeah,
that sounds good.
Just push them to the end. And I think the main thing is like when somebody comes to the doc, they also don't want to have to go through a bunch of like discussion items of historical stuff before, and then try and distill from that, like, well, what is the path forward? Like, what is being, put forth as the proposal? And that's kind of where I feel things are right now, is that there's like so much intermixed there that it's actually hard to kind of get to the meat of like, well, what is the real proposal at this point?
I think that the problem is that at some point, like you have to put out the different options, because otherwise we're just repeating the discussions all over again. Because like if now someone comes up, okay, we're using UUIDs or we're using identifiers, but we kind of already had this discussion. Maybe some people weren't part of this because at the time they didn't read through the stuff. But I think like having a place where you can have a look at the different pros and cons about the concepts, or at least I like this thing where you can go, okay, go to point 3, and there you see, okay, pros and cons about which identifiers to use.
To me, it's up to you whether you want to, start a new doc entirely, or, but like both of those concerns do need to be addressed, right? Like we need a clear description of what we have decided on, as well as, some sort of historical record. I would put more weight on having clear description of what has been decided rather than the historical record. But like this can be easily, I think, solved by having like, hey, these are the decisions that we've made in a doc, and then point to the other stuff. However you want to do that, I think. And I'll apologize because I think Tyler and Robert have been waiting for a little while.
I will just, as a relative newcomer here, say I've been trying to wrap my head around the materialized views proposals, and everything you're saying here would be very helpful, because I would love to know where things actually are. I really couldn't wrap my head around that, but I also agree with Jan that like having the historical options somewhere but separate would be fantastic, because
maybe that's the new doc. I don't know.
Yeah, but like purely having them, but having them separate would be really helpful, because otherwise you're just awash in the sea of options, and like I don't understand where we are.
So you think 2 documents would be a good solution, or should I just make it clearer that like some part is appendix and maybe you should push it down more? Or
I'm fine with either approach. Like appendix is fine, just like push it down below, and then like as long as we can reference those things, that's what we want. Nobody's advocating for erasing history or like dropping all that info. It's more, let's get a clear definition of where things are.
Yeah.
Robert?
Yeah, basically not specifically to materialized views, but in general, I think Jan's points are very valid, and having a history of that, I think that's consensus. But maybe just as a proposal, maybe put it in the markdown so that you can put it on the website and then say, okay, look, here's what we had.
Yeah, actually,
not prominently, but yeah.
I think that's a good idea. I think what we should be working towards is like a markdown doc that defines all of the materialized views stuff that we've decided on, right? And then we can reference and go back and say like, hey, here's the discussion in the Google Docs and things like that. But actually saying like, here's how materialized views work, here's where the metadata is tracked and things like that. Whether that is, partly updates to the view spec or whether that is a different doc, I think we do want to put that in the specs eventually.
right.
Bits?
Yeah, so I think one thing we may think in terms of process, Dan, could be something around the lines of like making sure that each thing has a particular owner, and that individual is responsible for, because I think there's so many, depending on the situation, you might have different needs for how you
We-
document these things.
We typically avoid assigning ownership because that
Oh yeah, that's right.
slows things down. You know, if you think that someone else is going to do it, then you know usually it just makes people not contribute or something like
Right.
that. So
Right.
I,
Okay.
I think
Never
in this
mind.
area, like it's fairly clear who's working on it. So
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'm trying to think through a way, like there needs to be one place for anything, I think. And this could be getting back to the milestone stuff or being able to track down, but like, you know, it would be great to have these lists of things that are being worked on. And then from there, you can kind of find out, you know, what's the what's the current head of the information, because there might be scattered in multiple places. There might be so many conversations, and it should be a group or an individual's like kind of responsibility to make sure that that is the up to date like first page that people should be seeing when they're looking in this issue. So
Brian, just like what we tried to do with the proposal process was there is a label for proposals, and that we're trying to keep that up to date with all the proposals that are out there right now. And one of the things is a link to ideally whatever the current version of the doc is, or you know later people can add subtasks or PRs or things to that. So that should be kind of the canonical place for, hey, where do you go to see the status of proposals? And we're trying to drive more people to that. What we might want to work towards, Brian, is adding some links from the website, because I think it's actually
that's what I'm trying to think is maybe how do I codify some of this information? Yeah. Okay. You and I can follow up on that maybe after, or is you and JB that are working on this primarily?
No, like we can go and figure
It's
out.
done.
Let's
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it's done. It was the discussion we had a while ago with Daniel and you. I think that the process on GitHub, it's clear. The only missing part is just on the website, linked to the GitHub directly research, and we're good.
Okay. Yeah, I'll follow JB. I'm going to follow up with you anyways on release stuff. So maybe you and I could just kind of swing back around to this. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, no,
Getting back to the materialized view stuff, it sounds like we understand the next steps are, you know, sort of document where we're at, and then you know, highlight the next decision points. Did you want to go over those? Yeah.
Well, the thing is, so currently I have the feeling that we have kind of two open discussion points, and I'm not sure if we should them discuss here, or maybe it would make sense to have a separate thing to discuss this, because I think right now we kind of have listed all the pros and cons about them and whether to use the different options, but we kind of need to make the real decisions, and I'm not sure what's the best process for that.
Is it something that we can do in probably 10, 15 minutes, or is it something that you think is going to require more time? Because if it's more time, we can just set up a you know, one of these for anyone who's interested, and you know, get that out there.
I think one point would be simpler. So there was a discussion whether so currently the situation is we have a view that's kind of referencing a storage table which stores the pre-computed data for the view. And the one question was whether to store this storage table pointer, the identifier of the storage table, as a table property or as an additional metadata field inside the view spec. So the options are property or a view property or additional metadata fields. I don't know if I think this could be resolved.
To me, it seems like that would be better as a view metadata property, optional view metadata, because we need to represent a full fidelity table identifier, I believe, unless we're thinking about referencing tables by UID or something. But I think that makes assumptions about what the catalog can handle to be able to load tables by UID. So I would say probably, you know, we have a way of expressing identifiers in JSON, and we should probably use that to provide a list of the materialized versions of that view.
Yeah, I think Jack mentioned we might want to have a separate meeting. I do think that that's worthwhile. I would also say I agree with Ryan. there are actually problems with using properties in general. There's like version history doesn't track with properties. There's other aspects that like it may seem convenient to use, but it actually causes a lot of problems with other aspects of just like lineage and history and everything else.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. So I think I'll try to organize a meeting where we can talk this in more detail.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you for taking that on. All right. Now we've got.
I put a list, by the way, on the side, and so let me know if anybody else should be on. Just chat in there real fast if you want to be part of that meeting.
Thanks. Okay, and then let's dive into some of these REST topics. Who wants to introduce security questions?
I can go ahead. I brought it up on the main list. So, yeah, I mean, as I wrote, while we're implementing Iceberg REST from Nessie, we tried to reason about this OAuth tokens endpoint and especially all its implications. And we've been talking with many people and discussing it back and forth, but nobody really could come up why we would need to implement it. And basically all the security guys said, no, go stay away from that. And so, I mean, yeah, there's a latent risk that if you do it naively, you would maybe implement it and then see, hey, I'm going into Keycloak issues, which is a huge project, 11 years of project, and it's huge. And there are issues with authorization, yada, yada. I think I don't need to elaborate on that. But if you do that, then you get into issues where you have much stronger auditing, quality control, and assurance. That's what people, especially enterprises or big companies, don't really like. And I think that also something that where most Iceberg REST implements don't want to go into. You could say, okay, then you could proxy it, but then you effectively become a man in the middle, and that's a huge security risk. And so people will ask us questions like, why does Iceberg need OAuth to the server side? So, and even if it's not implemented, then there's still the risk that implementations receive clear text, client ID, and client secrets. So there are ways to capture the information. I think that's a huge risk, and I think that's a risk that nobody from us wants to take. And sadly, the REST specification does not say that it's optional.
Yeah, I think this gets to the.
Might I finish?
Yes.
Can I finish first, and then we can discuss along. But and the REST specification also defines authorization details, which are, in my opinion, rather or spec concerns. So TLDR basically, I think Iceberg is a table format. Okay, it's becoming a catalog format, but definitely not an authorization system. And I'm usually a bit strict with that. I mean, the OAuth spec says, okay, you can do that. There's nothing that prevents you from doing that. But I would, for security reasons, I would strictly separate those systems. And I mean, if you implement OAuth, then why don't we just implement OIDC Connect or user information endpoints? I mean, that would be the logical consequence. And then you're definitely rebuilding one of these OAuth 2 systems, even if it's just Northalia or Authentic or whatever. So that's why we came up with saying, okay, let's get this endpoint out of the spec. If someone wants to implement that endpoint, okay, go ahead. And we would also like to propose that we require to enable OAuth 2, we would like to require that the OAuth 2 server URI property is present. So this is really just to make sure that nobody accidentally implements it and nobody accidentally proxies sensitive information.
Are you finished?
I'm good. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I think what we need here is some of the server capabilities stuff that we've been discussing on 9940. So we know that different REST catalogs and services are going to have basically different capabilities and different sets of endpoints that they support. Notably, we hit this when introducing views because not all REST endpoints implement the views, and we need to actually know because we don't have anything defined for I don't support some route. We don't have a HTTP return code for that. So essentially, like when we hit services that didn't support views, some would throw, authorization exceptions. Some would throw 404s. Everyone was doing different things, and because this is a forward compatibility issue, we don't actually know. We can't say like, hey, for any route that you don't expect or any endpoint that you don't know about, this is the behavior you should implement. I would throw this in the same category. So yes, there may be concerns for commercial implementations that have specific requirements. At the same time, this could be something where it makes it just easier to route to the correct place or something like that. So I think it makes sense to continue having this, but have the service declare or say probably whether or not it support that, or possibly do this on the client side. Server side capabilities may not be expressed by the time that this happens. So I think it's perfectly reasonable for us to make it clear what is or is not optional, and I think we also basically had this as an implicit thing in the spec, where you could have OAuth or you could have other authorization mechanisms. So we're just getting to, I think, a much more mature consensus around this.
Yeah, I mean, there are two things at play here. The client obviously can say, okay, I know about OAuth 2, I know about SigV4, I know about Anonymous. So that's rather a client decision. The other point is we propose to publish the OAuth 2 endpoint using a pre-flight config thing that's not password protected, but that's something that was considered insecure.
Yeah, I don't think a pre-flight endpoint is a good idea. This should probably come down to client configuration, right? Whether you are using a...
But then you can't use capabilities, no?
Yeah, actually, that's what I was just saying. I realized that server-side capabilities are probably not a good solution to this, because this needs to happen before you hit the config endpoint. So I agree. I think this comes down to client config. So I think, yeah, let's make sure it's clear, well documented, and that you're not hitting this endpoint unnecessarily. I don't necessarily agree that the existence is a problem for all users. I mean, it may not be something that your implementation chooses to use, but I don't necessarily think that it's all that problematic to have an endpoint that does this.
I would just add that, if it's unclear that it is an optional implementation, we can update the REST spec to clarify that. We did actually add language in there that you can use alternative auth servers along with properties to support that. So it may not be as explicit as we want, but that is the intention.
I mean, the problem I see is that the endpoint itself and all the types are present in the specification, and that might force users to say, okay, I have to implement that, and then people get into serious trouble.
So this is where the capabilities stuff comes back in. I was thinking,
but either you have a pre-flight endpoint and it says, okay.
So the capabilities in the spec are I believe implemented is labels in the spec that says like, hey, these are things that are groups of endpoints or groups of capabilities, right? Like the fact that some of those come back from the service doesn't really apply here because you don't hit the config endpoint first, but we could at least label this and add in the spec what it means to have, OAuth as part of the service versus OAuth is not part of the service, because we never intended for OAuth to be the only authentication mechanism here, right? What we're trying to do is make this a flexible enough spec that you have a small set of things that you can use to achieve what you want in terms of authentication and authorization. So, the OAuth endpoint here could be used for authentication, or you can swap that out for a different OAuth endpoint. But the important thing is that you're using the documented OAuth client credentials flow to do this. And so that's sort of where we're trying to aim for. Not saying that we got it perfect the first time, but we certainly can just clean up the spec and make it clear what is optional and what are sets of things that should be implemented together. And again, that's sort of what server capabilities is doing, although it's a little murky because it's mixed up with the capabilities coming back from that config endpoint. Thank you for waiting patiently, Dimitri. I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you. Just wanted to say something. I mean, I have a lot of things to say, but the most important one from my point of view is like if we're talking about the optionality of the token endpoint, I would say that it's a matter of specification kind of consistency, right? Because there is an OAuth 2 RFC that actually defines how OAuth 2 is supposed to function, right? If that token endpoint actually fits under the RFC, why don't we just say the client in certain situations just follows the defined RFC, the flows that are defined by the RFC, and takes the URL to execute those flows from a config or discovery or whatever, right? So just to reemphasize, why do we have to specify the OAuth 2 part as part of the catalog REST specification?
So the specifications here are saying like what are valid authentication and authorization schemes. I guess not authorization because that should be hidden behind the API, but I think we need to document and say what are valid authentication schemes, right? And that's really what we're trying to do is say, the OAuth client credentials flow is a valid scheme for getting a bearer token for the other endpoints. So yeah, if we can clean that up, by all means, let's do that.
Yes, so sorry, Jack, I kind of reinserted myself in the queue. But I mean, regarding the valid schemes, it's a good point. But my perspective on this is beyond the actual catalog spec, right? Because catalog spec defines the protocol for interacting with Iceberg metadata, right?
Yeah.
So we can say that this protocol has to be authenticated and authorized somehow, right? So we can talk about how you submit your credentials through this protocol. How you interpret those credentials is actually part of the OAuth 2 spec or IDC or whatever, right? It's a different domain, so to speak, right? So I think we should make a distinction between actually using credentials to access a resource, in this case, the REST catalog server, versus obtaining those credentials.
Cool. Yeah, I'm definitely all for doing that. What we need though is we're trying to balance chaos and predictability, right? So we want to refer to other things where it is possible, but we also want to have a fairly predictable way that these things work, so that there's commonality across the different implementations. So the client credentials flow from OAuth is a really good way to have a key and secret and exchange those for a bearer token that you can use with the other endpoints. The intent here was really like The intent is to use OAuth for that, and to specify if you don't have an endpoint, because we don't want people specifying 2 endpoints for everything necessarily, is where that endpoint is if you don't have a separate one. That was the intent. Maybe we need to clarify that, but I don't think that it is a huge issue. Like let's just plan on fixing it.
Yeah, that is fine. But I would still say that if we have co-located authentication and actual REST server, the definition of the token doesn't have to be part of the definition of the REST protocol, right? It can be co-located. It can be auto-discoverable by a well-known pattern, but it doesn't have to be part of the REST spec. That's my point.
Yeah, sure, but it is. It's an optional part of the REST spec, just so that we all agree on, if you are doing this, where is it located?
Sorry, Jack, I think I made you wait. Go ahead.
Yeah, no problem. I think I read the proposal on the dev thread a few times, and I'm starting to also leaning towards maybe removing the endpoint is a better option. And the reason is that suppose what we are talking about here, which is that we support having that having the OAuth 2 endpoint as some client configurations that user can supply. Then what is the point of leaving that in the spec anymore? Because that is only a client configuration, and you can say the endpoint is the same as the REST client. That can be the default, or it can be a different one. And at that point, OAuth is just like a authentication plugin that is doing the authentication dance before you hit the REST endpoint. And I can say it can be exactly the same. It can be a framework that OAuth 2 implements, and not a framework, an interface that OAuth 2 implements, and like SigV4 also implements, and Google OSS also SSO also implements. And then the REST catalog spec becomes truly separated from like whatever authentication mechanism you are using. That seems to be
the problem is that it's not predictable and it's not documented, right? It's not that we're trying to force everyone to use a particular endpoint for OAuth 2. It is that we want to document what the expectations are or what those defaults are. So if we agree that like this is the default, then like I think that we should just document it. But to me, like the point is not whether this is part of the YAML file or not. Like it's that we write down how this works, like how we write down that we write down how the reference client is operating. That was the intent here.
Because I feel the fact that it is in the REST catalog spec right now seems to at least give the feeling, even if we say it's optional, but at least gives the feeling that it is the preferred authentication mechanism for using the spec.
Well,
and however, on the other side,
right,
there are
also in the
also
spec.
people just send API gateway endpoints and use SigV4, right? I feel if we want to make sure that the spec is independent of the authentication aspect, then it has to make like the spec is independent, and then you have maybe a section saying that here are the supported authentication mechanisms, and these are the defaults. If you choose to use one of them, that should be the layout in my mind.
That's exactly what I'm saying. We should have labels on these endpoints, right? The endpoint being in the spec so that we can say, this is what the default is. If you don't specify a different endpoint, cool. But like, let's just update the spec to be clear about the intent, which is you have multiple authentication schemes, and this endpoint is, one of the things that you can use to avoid client configuration in an OAuth scheme.
Jack, I just want to jump in and respond, because I think we're focusing a lot on what happens to be in the YAML. We probably overspecified a little in including the actual exchange request and token request, because that's really just taken directly out of the RFC from OAuth, right? And I think what a lot of people are saying is, hey, that doesn't really need to be in the spec. Yeah, maybe not. But at the same time, the spec does have a section to clarify what are the security schemes that are supported or defined. And what we're trying to do is make sure that if people are using OAuth 2, it's clear what those flows look like and how the clients will actually move through those flows and what needs to be respected or not. So there may be some clarification here, but I don't think that we want to kind of completely strip out everything around security schemes, because we also want to have kind of a paved path of like how the reference implementations should be working through these things.
I will let other people, since there are multiple hands.
Yeah, I'll just add another aspect other than the whether if we want to add OS spec into the REST catalog spec. So another perspective I want to bring in is I think we all agree on that it's not a good practice to have the resource server to handle these credential stuff, right? So with that, I think maybe optional sounds not an ideal situation here. What we can do is we kind of deprecate it, because we want to discourage people to discover all this implementation on top of that, right? You can still do that, of course. You can still, for each implementation, you can still put together with REST catalog endpoints and the token endpoints together with REST catalog endpoints. But the client has to trust that, right? That's my perspective. You can still put together, and the client have to configure that. But it's overall, we want to discourage people, whoever implements this, to implement this within the REST catalogs, either proxy or you use own database to handle use credential and refresh token for that. Yeah, that's yeah, I think my proposals, we can make it option might not be an ideal solution here. We may just deprecate it to prevent any further implementation on top of that.
Should we hear from Alex? I see his hand is up. I think he spoke yet.
Hey, yeah, I just wanted to stress the fact that we have many other flows in OAuth that we could implement in the future. And my team would very much like to contribute those flows. So if you take the authorization code flow, for example, a very interesting one, but it requires other endpoints. So the token endpoint that we have currently defined, the spec is not enough. We need an external authorization server for that.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted to say as well. So now if we say the token endpoint is optional, even if we don't say it's optional, but say if we say that you can configure an alternative endpoint, now the question comes up: the way auth is done in the REST spec does not extend to the full RFC capabilities, right? So if we switch to a different or RFC to a different auth service, say Keycloak or Authelia, what would the client be compatible, right? Because by maintaining the token endpoint in this spec, we kind of not restriction, but we're not promoting the REST client to support the other implementations, right? That's,
So
I think Robert raised that point as well. So yeah, if we say auth 2 is a possible authentication mechanism, then why don't we extend the full range of flows?
by all means, like, propose something. I mean, to me, like, we tried to write down what we did. And right now there's like a fairly minor concern, which is, hey, sometimes you want this to be separate. And in certain cases, you want a separate authorization. Like, I'm not convinced that it's terrible in all cases to have these be the same service. because like we're making assumptions about, you know, the shape of these platforms. But like, to me, this is all sort of a pedantic, you know, sort of overly specific discussion. Like, let's figure out how OAuth 2 should work, and like the right relationship between the REST catalog spec and the OAuth 2 spec, and let's implement that rather than like focusing on the fact that we wrote down what it is doing today. Does that make sense? Like, I'm totally open to what you guys are saying. Like, let's definitely do that. But I like, let's have a replacement and somewhere that we're going to, rather than saying like this should not be there.
So yeah, I can say something. What Robert is next in line, I guess.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight that security is, in my opinion, definitely not a minor concern and not pedantic at all. Because security is something that sorry, let me finish. That
all right, guys, and I gotta go.
Okay. Security is something that people, especially in data world, heavily rely on. And having security implemented wrong is, in my opinion, a no-go.
So I think Ryan had to drop, and we're at time. Robert, I don't think anybody disagrees with you. Everybody thinks security is important. I think the nuance of what we're talking about here can't be just brushed away with, you know, a blanket, hey, security is important, so we have to do it this one specific way. So let's get a discussion. If you guys have a proposal, I would encourage you to write up a proposal for it. Use the issue to make proposal to change the REST spec, and we can go through that in more detail. But I would agree, like we actually need to go through a real detailed review of what we're doing with OAuth. And right now, I don't feel like we're making progress on that. We're just kind of arguing, you know, pedantic points about the OAuth spec and how we think it should behave or not. So let's get to a proposal. And if you guys want to put that together, we're happy to move forward and have a more focused discussion on that. So
yeah, just a quick note, I mean, since we're still here online. So the spec change proposal is one thing, but I think we also can make a couple of specific improvements to the REST client that would allow it to be interoperable with Keycloak and Ophelia. Would you be open to those PRs?
I think we're open to that. The concern that we have is, you know, we found that some of those don't properly implement the OAuth spec. And so they've made concessions or their own, you know, specific approaches to deal with that. And so, you know, there's a concern about like, okay, well, if we go in that direction, do we hyper specialize on like Keycloak's implementation of it versus, you know, Okta or something else? So open to it, but let's get those things written down so we can review the specific like changes that we're looking at. I can't say just arbitrarily that, hey, yeah, we're gonna like focus on Keycloak or something like that. I think we're over time, and I do have to run. So, you know, we can pick this up in the next one, or hopefully we have something to actually like look at in between, so we can have a more focused discussion next time around.
Do we think it makes sense, Dan, to, I know you got to run, do you think it makes sense to try to bring up another meeting for this one as well, along with the Materialize You one?
Let's get the proposals out first.
Okay, sure.
And then we can decide, like, do we need more time or can we handle it kind of offline with the proposal?
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for the discussion.
Thank you.
Take care, y'all.